So for those of you who are not aware, Joe Biden was the president of the United States of America from 2021 to 2025. And throughout that time, there were questions, and also before that time, there were questions about Joe Biden's mental fitness. Now, if you are not particularly sophisticated or savvy, you might be convinced that those questions were entirely related to Joe Biden's age, because that was what a lot of people who were running interference for Joe Biden wanted you to think, that it was just people being mean because Joe Biden is old. You know, look how old Joe Biden is. Like, people are being ageist. It really wasn't just that made people concerned about his mental fitness. It was the fact that he had many brain issues, like I think aneurysms and strokes in the recent and not recent past, and also his actions. But the ageism was a way for people to kind of like paper over that by making it seem like people were just being bigoted against our old president. In the aftermath of his disastrous debate performance in June of last year, maybe July, I forget exactly when it was, let's say sometime June, July, you know, there started to become a slow trickle of information about Joe Biden's mental fitness not quite being what people were told it was before the presidency, but right before his presidency and during his presidency. And this took the form of a variety of like leaks. You know, I think a lot of people remember most readily the article or letter from George Clooney, which we kind of read a little bit more about a few weeks ago. George Clooney's experiences, we read a little bit more about. And since then, there's been a slow trickle of additional stories from insiders, from media figures about his mental fitness at the time, none of which portray it in a very positive light. And a lot of that has sort of culminated in the release of this book called Original Sin by Alex Thompson and Jake Tapper. I'm not too familiar with Alex Thompson, but I will say Jake Tapper is not without blame for running interference for Joe Biden, as many members of the media did during his presidency and before, as people were raising these concerns. So I thought it would be, a good transition, a good transition from the Fetterman story, a good topic to address again, since the book is coming out soon. And I will say, I'm not really interested in the revisionist narratives from the media or the members of the Joe Biden administration, the staffers, the Democratic senators, et cetera, the revisionist narratives of like how they couldn't have known, how they didn't know, how they were forced to not tell. All of that stuff, and we'll have to take it on a case-by-case basis, is bullshit. I don't know what specific flavor of bullshit it is. That's why we have to say it's like a case-by-case basis. But I would be highly skeptical of anybody who had access to Joe Biden saying that they did not realize that there was something wrong with Joe Biden because of what George Clooney said, which is that he didn't have a lot of access to Joe Biden, but he noticed something was wrong in the few incidents that he saw him. So anyone that you see currently raising the flag about Joe Biden's mental health issue in the media, in the Democratic Party space, is doing so not out of any sort of positive coming to Jesus moment, that where they realize that, oh, maybe the American people deserve to not be lied to when it comes to the mental fitness of the president. This is being done, and I really want to emphasize this because some people are always looking for a reason to have more faith in, the bad actors in our political media and our political class. This is done for the same reasons. This is being done for the same reasons that they were hiding it, because it's what's best for their career. The people coming out with these stories about Joe Biden's mental fitness, who had access to him this entire time, are just now realizing that since the story can't be covered up anymore because he's not the president, it's in their best interest career-wise, professionally, to start like crafting a new narrative where they knew, they were aware of it, but they just couldn't tell for one reason or another. No. Of course they could. What they really mean is they couldn't tell and 100% expect to keep whatever position they have in the media, 100% expect to keep access to Joe Biden and to be able to use the power that access to Joe Biden granted them. Because what will happen in situations like this, and it's not just situations where people are running interference for Joe Biden, it's any situation where the media was sitting on something that basically anyone with two eyes could have said and would have seen as the truth, until it's way too late to affect change or way too late to be meaningful to come out with it. And you'll see this too when, if and when the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza by Israel is over, you'll see a lot of these like come to Jesus moments in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And don't fall for it. These are all motivated by, again, like rank careerism, craven shamelessness. Like it's all the same thing that led them to hide the fact and the truth in the first place, and it's what was best for them. And so you just have to be aware that like the people who are saying these things after the fact, once it's way too late to affect change, they're doing so because for the same reasons that they hit it, because it's what's best for their career now. And you just have to, call it out. You have to be aware that like these people are, again, shameless careerists, and you can't let them substitute the fact that they didn't have a good time doing the wrong thing with some kind of real accountability or reckoning for like the bad things that they did, because you'll see a lot of that too. I'm not aware of what's in this clip, but I'm just pointing out some like broad patterns that you see in people who like hide this kind of stuff or like who don't do a good job in critical news media. They will oftentimes, and not even just don't do a good job, people who like sometimes take positions, not just in news media, not just in politics or like for a particular politician, but at places like a weapons manufacturer or like Fox News, like they will sometimes use the fact that they didn't have a good time in that position, like the job was hard or like people were mean to them, and or even things as like severe as like, oh, I experienced racism at working at Fox News, aka the racism factory. A lot of people will try to use those things as exculpatory facts about like why technically none of what happens there is their fault, and why you should actually feel bad for them for having like having a bad moral compass. So it is just something to keep in mind of like, don't let the ex-staffers of the Biden administration try to make you feel bad for them because like Joe Biden would yell at them because he was an old demented man. Like it's their fault, honestly, because they wanted to like position themselves within that administration for money, for power, and that's why they hit it, and that's why they're doing this now. So like, just don't let them try to use their own like negative personal experiences manipulating an old demented man to like justify or to hide that like that's what they were doing. So like I'm sure we'll address these points again, but let's start with this video from CBS News with Alex Thompson talking about the alleged cover-up of Biden's declining health. And forgive me if I vape while my mic is muted. I'm just going to do that, but you'll have to forgive me. Let's see. Oh, also let me know how the sound is.
Everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
It was answers like that during then President Biden's debate with now President Trump that allowed Democratic confidence in him to first atrophy, then collapse, forcing him ultimately out of the presidential race, as we all remember. And a new book finds Biden's inner circle tried very hard and in many ways to hide, shield, and obfuscate what they recall, and many Democrats now are willing to talk about, his mental and physical decline. I spoke with the co-author of that book. It's called Original Sin, Alex Thompson, earlier today. What is the sin and what makes it the first one or the original sin?
Well, this title actually came about as Democrats were wondering how they lost. So from the Democratic perspective, the sin was Donald Trump winning. And so as Democrats, right after the election, we started this book on November 6th, as Democrats were sort of looking at the wreckage and wondering, how did this go wrong? A few people kept saying, going back and said, the original sin of this election, the most consequential moment, the biggest reason we lost. There are other things, Joe Rogan, not going on Joe Rogan, and Kamala Harris not being able to do media interviews. Yes, that's all bad. But the original sin was Joe Biden deciding to run for re-election.
How much of that openness to discuss this original sin that cropped up suddenly in the smoldering ruin of the election outcome struck you as a reporter as CYA?
I mean, I think it was both CYA and also relief, and feeling that they could finally say it. Because I think there was an element of fear that had basically rendered them all mute throughout the election. I mean, it was clear that to so many Democrats, I think we detail many instances of Democrats, both inside the administration and on Capitol Hill, that saw Joe Biden in 2023 and 2024 especially, and thought to themselves, he's not up to this, and they didn't say anything. And so I think some people were doing this with pangs of regret. I think also some people were like, the election's not our fault. Like it's all Joe Biden's fault. And I think what we try to do in this book is that we don't try to make it, it's all Joe Biden's fault. It's that Joe Biden decided to run for re-election, and then the entire Democratic Party, including people that knew better, that knew he was, if not even up to running a re-election campaign, certainly knew that he was not up to being president for 4 more years, did not say anything out of fear, and fear both of their own political careers, but also fear that doing so would only hurt Biden, make him dig in deeper, and then help Donald Trump.
Okay, so I'm going to address a few of those points real quick. And I appreciate that he is engaging at this at a level that I even maybe wasn't expecting, but I do still expect him to absolve members of the media of their role in this. The first thing I will say is that this is the inherent flaw to the post-Biden, flub at the June 27th debate. This is the inherent flaw to throwing the people trying to throw Biden under the bus right now. And it's not always the case, right? Like in these cases where you let the bad thing happen, you keep your mouth shut because you're afraid of your job, or you're afraid of losing your job. And then once it's clear that's not going to happen anymore because the situation that made you afraid is just over, you try to rush out and be the first person to throw whatever person was actually in your mind responsible under the bus once it's far too late. The issue in this particular circumstance is that what they're trying to throw Joe Biden under the bus for is something that, and you know me, I say it all the time, I am not a Joe Biden defender. I'm not somebody who is constantly caping for Joe Biden. I don't even like Joe Biden. I think he's an old racist and likely sexual criminal too, right? And I've been saying that since 2019. You can go back and listen to all episodes of the podcast where we say we're not going to vote for Joe Biden for very similar reasons, and we talk about his mental fitness as one of those reasons. In this very specific circumstance where his staffers, where other Democratic Party officials are trying to point to Joe Biden as the source of the problem, every other circumstance, yeah, I agree. But this charge is that Joe Biden was mentally incapacitated, that he was suffering from some unspecified age-related and previous brain health-related neurodegenerative disorder, as a result of senescence, as a result of previous strokes. So I am forced to contend, and I've said it before, Joe Biden can't be held responsible for making bad decisions, no more than when you agree to watch your grandpa with dementia and prevent him from driving. Can he be held responsible if he gets behind the wheel of a car because you gave him his keys or didn't take them away? The very thing they're trying to, now admit that Joe Biden has is what makes him unable to be held legitimately responsible for the action of not being able to determine his limits or determine where and when he can and can't do something. And so you have a bunch of people who are who were circling around a mentally incapacitated president who are now saying can you believe that grandpa wouldn't voluntarily put his keys down just because he had dementia? Can you believe that can you believe that? And it's yes, I can, because I understand what that does to people's brains. It's you being in the position where you could have possibly rung the alarm bells and gotten his keys taken away from him, but chose not to for your own craven careerism. That's a much bigger problem. You being afraid of losing your job to the point in which you just keep quiet about the president of the United States of America being possibly, having Alzheimer's, possibly having dementia. I'm not his brain doctor, I'm not his neurologist. I've never performed an MRI or a CAT scan or whatever the fuck they do to people's brains to tell what's wrong with them. So I don't know. But they're trying to throw someone under the bus in the one instance where they really can't be held responsible for making the wrong decision. And they're doing so for the careerism that he's talking about. But that's just the through line here. No one learned anything. No one learned that it was bad. No one learned that you shouldn't abuse the elderly. What people are doing is that they're trying to save their own butt. I just think that in this particular circumstance, it's what are you trying to accuse him of being an old man who had dementia and not being able to tell what is and is not the right thing to do? I know that. That was your job theoretically, and you abdicated that responsibility. And it's a little, it's a little disappointing to see people not necessarily reach that conclusion yet, where it's like, okay, but the thing that you're charging with him is exactly, in this case, the exculpatory fact that makes it more your fault than it does his fault. Because like, I don't expect an old man with dementia to be able to tell what his limitations are. I expect the younger people around him to be able to tell and to do like the right, most responsible thing, and to not like prioritize their own careers over what the right thing is. But that's what happened then. That's what's happening now. And so we just have to be clear that the people who were around him likely should not have jobs in politics anymore. And, you know, the media that's going to be trying to redeem themselves are likely also just going to be showing the fact that they're not critical news. They're like, you know, they just report like press releases.
In 2017, there was a book that a lot of Americans saw, many read, called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. A bunch of psychiatrists got together and diagnosed what they described as dangerous psychological tendencies of Donald Trump, writing that it was their duty to warn the country. And one of the things they pointed out was what they detected was a kind of malignant narcissism. Should there have been, did there needed to have been a book with the title The Dangerous Case of Joe Biden?
You know, well, first of all, that book, I don't necessarily think had the effect the authors intended, given that. So I don't know if a book would have...
But evaluating Joe Biden as not just a typically narcissistic politician, but one driven by narcissism to a point of blindness, so far that his narcissism began to infect the Democratic Party and essentially, as you and Jake Tapper report in this book, silenced so many people who otherwise knew better.
It's so interesting because Democrats love to mock Republicans for saying something different about Donald Trump in quiet, in private, and saying something different publicly, and then this sort of dear leader stuff. But if you read this book, they were doing the exact same thing.
It is a mirror image of that.
Yes, absolutely.
They are the ones who are now being mocked, that history is likely to mock.
I think so, and the way that they also treated those, similarly.
And that's why they're throwing him under the bus now, because they're being mocked. Because when it looked good for your career, you did the one thing. And like he's saying, like, it's just hypocrisy. Like, the Republicans and Democrats have a lot in common.
You remember in 2017.
But like I was saying, I know people might feel like I'm making excuses for Joe Biden. I believe he's a narcissist. I believe he has a lot in common with Donald Trump. But the very specific claim here is that he was unfit to run for president, not as a result of his narcissism or his Zionism or any other things that I don't like, but because of a very specific issue with his brain. Might be dementia, might be Alzheimer's, might be brain damage from strokes. Don't know, not really relevant. But that particular thing that's wrong with his brain would lead me to believe that he can't make that decision. And so trying to throw him under the bus for not making the right decision when he lacked the faculties to do it, and you had them because you didn't want to like risk losing your job, and then like, well, you can't be a political insider anymore. That's part of your identity. It's like the Lindy Lee thing. It's like, that's not really a redeemable like type of narrative about like, why you didn't do the right thing.
2018, some of those congressional Republicans that stuck their necks out, people like Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, and then they were just completely decapitated by their own party. Look at what happened to Dean Phillips. Dean Phillips spoke out, and he is no longer in Congress.
Right. Is there, and for you and Jake, looking at the reporting on this, do you think that there was a moment when this rickety scaffolding actually began to collapse separate from the debate performance?
Yes.
Or was, okay, please.
Fall of 2023, I think, is when, obviously we sort of say like good Biden and old Biden. Good.
I should say, the reason I'm listening to this stuff and the reason I might even buy the book is not because I'm interested, and I will find it probably very grating to see people like Jake Tapper, people who orbited around him, or at least interacted with him once or twice, not take responsibility in any real way for like their contributing to his problem. I'm mostly just interested in like the gossip, to be honest. I'm interested in like, hearing the behind the scenes specific instances like that we knew were happening, but didn't have any like, clear picture of what exactly it was. That's what I'm interested in. All of the stuff where like, people who interviewed him said like, well, the Democrats told me he was fine and this person told me he was fine. And I thought I just chose not to believe what I could see and hear with my own eyes and ears. So like that stuff, I've already expressed how I feel about that.
Biden or functioning Biden and non-functioning Biden. I mean, back in 2019, 2020, you covered that primary too. Like there were moments that were like, That's a little odd.
Right.
But for the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time, he was a little slower, but, was definitely like with it. I think, the fall of 2023, I would say a few different factors. One is his son Hunter's plea deal unravels. A special counsel is appointed by Joe Biden's own attorney general to investigate his son and his son's business dealings that involve all sorts of the family. You have October 7th, and also aging is unpredictable. And by all accounts, from the more than 200 people that we talked to, and we almost exclusively interviewed Democrats because we wanted sort of this internal reckoning that the party was going through. We didn't, yes, Kevin McCarthy has something to say, other members, Republican members, but we wanted to get the internal Democrats, and Democrats that saw him at that time noticed a precipitous decline, that basically the ratio of functioning to non-functioning Biden not only changed significantly, but non-functioning Biden became much worse and would come out in unpredictable ways. And that's when you start seeing the inner Praetorian Guard, or Royal Palace Guard, as Chuck Schumer refer to them, really start shielding him more and more because they can't predict. And so they're basically like white knuckling it until the debate, their luck runs out.
There's so much fascinating reporting in here.
Which, in my opinion, just shows how stupid they are. Like, the original sin. I don't want to say it's the original sin, because that would just be me trying to like make something work that doesn't really work. But the fact that they let that debate happen the way they did, I think is a sign of political malfeasance, because anything else would have been better than that. So I in my heart, I like to think that this was the members of the staff like self-sabotaging the campaign, so that the truth would finally get out of there, would get out into the, the discourse, the public sector, right? The public, subconsciously, because so many other things would have been better than letting Joe Biden get on that stage. And you just had to know that he wasn't going to like do well. So like, there's only a few explanations for it that I think make sense, which is, the first is the really generous one, which is that they got tired of lying. And sometimes you get tired of lying, you just like set yourself up to fail in a way subconsciously that allows you to be able to stop lying. The other is that like, they have a very low opinion of the American people, and they just felt like most Americans wouldn't even notice. They didn't notice for the past 4 years, right? And I think that's a very dangerous place to be in too, where it's like you have both a low opinion of the American people's ability to like take in reality and analyze it and engage with it in a meaningful way. Or you've been around the problem for so long that you've just kind of normalized that it's like this, and you kind of just fail to still see the gravity of the situation. You're like, yeah, he might do a little, he might not be great, but people will just like get over it. You just like, you've normalized it. You've like become the frog in the boiling water who just doesn't understand that like you're being boiled alive. Or like I said, they just relied on the other elements of the campaign, or they thought the elements of the campaign would be good enough to be able to like pull back from what was going to happen at the debate. So like, I think there are very few good outcomes of that debate, or, even good analyses of why they would let that happen. But obviously the problem had been going on for a very long time, because people were calling it out back in 2018. It was obvious back in 2018. And people would shout you down if you point out. They would say he has a stutter. They would say he has a childhood stutter. When he told that story about corn pop, they said he's told that story because he has a stutter. And people in the media repeated that. And now the people in the media who repeated stupid shit like that want you to feel like that totally made sense. And how could you expect them to know any better than what they were being told? It's like, I don't know. What kind of stutter makes you tell racist stories? Like, what kind of stutter makes you stammer until you say the N-word? I don't like, I mean, guess maybe Tourette's, right? But that's not what they were saying he had. That's not what they were saying he had. So it's just hard for me to feel, in any way amenable to the argument that like, well, how could you expect anyone in the media to know any better? And then to the point of like the Praetorian Guard, like the Queen's Guard surrounded Joe Biden in order to prevent people from having meaningful interactions with him in such a way that allows them to claim that they never noticed something was wrong. I got to be honest, that really sounds like the I stuck my head in the sand purposely argument so that I wouldn't see the bad thing. So you can't accuse me of knowing the bad thing happened, if that makes any sense. Like, you don't have the luxury of when you're the leader of the Democrats in the Senate to never see the president, and to, if they deny you seeing the president for 2, 3, 4 months in a row, to just go like, well, I guess he's just really busy and I guess I'll just not see him. And, to me, allowing that kind of thing to happen, like being the kind of person who should have access to the president for one reason or another, and then like not having that access, and then the little bit of access you do have leads you to like, or could reasonably lead someone to believe there's something wrong with him, and then not vigorously pursuing increased access to him, just tells me that you didn't want to know something was wrong, which just makes you guilty. Like, people don't get to just stick their head in the sand in these circumstances and not find out something that was very in front of them or could have been in front of them, and then go like, well, it's not my fault, I just didn't have access. Like, that's kind of what Sam Bankman-Fried tried to argue in court when he was on trial for like the fraud, which is that like, well, no, everyone was doing fraud around me, and I theoretically had all the tools and access to find out about the fraud, and there were things that were suspicious going on that would make me believe something was untoward was happening, but I chose not to look into it. So can you really blame me for it? It's like, yes, actually we can. That because you could be argued to have, one could argue that you went out of your way to avoid trying to find this out so that you could make this argument later, because you're not like a moron. So you knew that this would be happening in the future and you tried to insulate yourself from these critiques. This is what, like, I think, a lot of these stories sound like, if they are to be believed, even at their face value. People felt like something was going on, but didn't want to be responsible for it. And so they just chose not to use any of the tools at their disposal to get more access to find out. In George Clooney's case, he said he met him 3 times over the course of like 4 years, and he could tell. And so like the conclusion one could draw is that like, if George Clooney could tell, one might say the average person could tell. And from that conclusion, you should say like, well, then either the Democrats are intellectually sub-average or they're lying about it for one reason or another. They're careerists, they were afraid for some nebulous reason, like, but they're lying about it. But you got to be careful, because the Democrats and Republicans like have this kind of really weird obverse relationship when it comes to like how they take responsibility for fucking people over. Like, there's a spectrum of evil to stupid, right? That people use to explain people's actions, right? There's the, I forget what the adage is, but don't attribute to malice what can be attributed to more readily attributed to ignorance or something like that. Like, politicians in America operate on that spectrum because it really is just one or the other usually, where the Democrats are oftentimes acting like evilly, and they want you to think that they're just being incredibly naive or incredibly trusting or incredibly credulous or incredibly overly deferential to like the legitimacy afforded to people by procedural, going through the procedural steps of everything, blah, 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 blah. Like, they're very happy for you to think that they're just so stupid that they let these things slip by them every time. Where Republicans, and it should be obvious now, are oftentimes like both evil and stupid, but a lot of their bad actions that lead to bad consequences are not targeted, especially in the Trump administration, like targeted evil actions. Republicans are at this point just incredibly stupid, and when they operate in that incredibly stupid way, a lot of bad things just happen. But they would prefer for you to think that they're evil geniuses who are like, oh no, Trump's tariff policy is him being like an evil genius, and that's why like he's able to like navigate these pump and dumps with his inner circle. It's like, no, that's just a post hoc justification. Trump is stupid. Trump is like a moron, and he's doing these bad things because like they fulfill him in some really base way, and by base I mean like lowbrow, not like online based God little b. And so just be aware of a lot of like these kinds of arguments coming out from the Democrats, because they just want you to think that they're stupid. And if you're a savvy person, you might think to yourself like, hey, isn't being so stupid to the point in which your actions could be confused for being evil like a bad thing? And the answer is yes, obviously it's a bad thing. But what you have to understand is that Democrats feel like they're unaccountable too, just like Republicans. And so it doesn't matter if you think they're stupid or evil. In a lot of cases, you can't get rid of them without in some way inconveniencing yourself even worse by like empowering Republicans. And so the belief that they're really stupid is more for like the turbo libs to have some kind of like, moral soothing and for them when it comes to like, wondering why stuff like this happens. They want to be able to soothe the emotions of like their most vigorous supporters, like the people who like watch NPR, sorry, listen to NPR, read the New York Times op-ed sections. They want to be able to say like, oh no, Nancy Pelosi isn't bad, Chuck Schumer isn't bad. They're not bad. They're too trusting. They're just too simple. They're too naive to like have figured this out. And everyone else would say like materially that's the same thing. But for people who like aren't going to say that, it feels better than go like, well, they're just evil. They're just evil and cowardly.
About the elaborate and increasingly elaborate.
Exactly. Violent Red Panda on Twitter says it helps with the cognitive dissonance. Like, yeah, it helps with that particular segment of the voter base's cognitive dissonance when it comes to why Democrats fail to do the right thing or seemingly always do the wrong thing. And it's not because they're evil. It's because of some version of being like stupid, ignorant, naive, credulous that can be framed as like actually a positive. Where, like I said, Republicans and their base of voters like tend to rather believe that like their party is like, being evil, like, but smartly evil.
Mechanisms that this Praetorian Guard, this Politburo, whatever the phraseology used by either supporters or critics or those who really didn't have a dog in the fight but saw this clique of people around President Biden, the things that they went through and then orders they gave to try to minimize the visibility and the accumulated political harm of his decline.
Well, it's so interesting that we can use so many different phrases, Praetorian Guard, Royal Palace Guard, and that's because this sort of system has existed in so many power centers all across history, all across cultures. And I think sometimes there's this feeling like, well, America, we're different. But like sometimes that sort of thing happens here. And what you saw over the course of
happening here.
October 2023, for example, this is more of a physical thing than a mental thing, but it's the first thing that comes to mind. They were terrified that he was going to have another fall because they were told that another fall would mean potentially a wheelchair, and that also he might even need a wheelchair in a second term anyway because his spine was degenerating. And so, they insisted on handrails every single place. They wanted to make the stairs shorter, not just on Air Force One.
Okay, but and I hate to stop it so quickly after I stopped it last time, because like obviously people want to watch the video, and I know I interject a lot, but objection. Because I just heard that Joe Biden just found out that he had bone cancer like 2-3 days ago, like last week, right? But now you're telling me that he was getting such extreme like physical checkups that they had known that his spine was deteriorating, but they didn't catch any kind of like cancer spreading to his bone during those tests. I guess I'm not an orthopedist or someone who specializes in an osteopath, whatever. That's not what person who specializes in bones, osteology. But it just, a lot of this stuff, we're just finding out so much stuff at the same time that is just so contradictory that it's going to take a while before we can actually parse through like what happened, when it happened, who knew what exactly. But it does, even with the information we have right now, it does not paint a really flattering picture of the Democratic Party or the Democratic Party aligned media. And it also paints a very stark picture of why running interference for the Democratic Party machine is oftentimes not the best idea when it comes to like actually ensuring that the best outcome for society happens. An oncologist studies cancer. I was trying to remember the name of somebody who studies like bones.
But everywhere. They wanted to limit the distance he had to walk any single time. They gave him new shoes, obviously. Other little things, because his energy became increasingly limited, public events in the early mornings or late at night or even just in the early evening, those were definitely pushed off. When he would film like campaign commercials, and people on the campaign said this man could not speak. The amount of hours they had to put in order to make a digital video seemed to make sense. Were just astronomical. And many campaigns need 2 cameras in order to like deal with what they're called jump cuts. Right. But they needed so many of them to make anything presentable. At one point, the campaign even does a fake town hall, stage town hall, closed to press, so they can campaign to do a campaign commercial. And this isn't that unusual. Other campaigns have done this, but usually those campaigns are actually having candidates that are doing town halls.
Every town hall seems fake to me.
So they do this stage town hall in Delaware with supporters. They film the whole thing, and then the campaign determines that footage is unusable because he was still struggling to communicate.
How much of this story, Alex, is driven by the mythology of Joe Biden? Meaning, I was always given short odds by Democratic insiders, always underestimated. I beat Trump. I can only beat Trump. That's my myth. That's what I believe.
I'm going to tell you right now, 0% of any of this has to do with Joe Biden specifically. That's the real bad part of all of these things that we're seeing. So much of this stuff is just like people being stand-ins. Like Joe Biden personally can't really, besides in the people who work very, very closely with him, engender loyalty in anybody. This was all everyone looking out for themselves and manipulating Joe Biden as he manipulates them to get their way. Like the mythology of Joe Biden. The biggest myth about Joe Biden is that he, like when they were calling him Honest Joe for a little bit, that was
everyone
crazy.
Has to ride along with me.
Yeah, I mean, he has been the mythology of Joe Biden.
And some of those things are true. I'm not suggesting they aren't.
Look at all the things Joe Biden has overcome in his life. I mean, even before the recent presidency.
Okay.
Obviously you have the accident. You have the fact that he lost in 1988, then overcame 2 brain aneurysms. He got his butt kicked in the 2008 primary, then became vice president. Then and then he won the 2020 Democratic primary. Won the to your point. He can recite chapter and verse.
He was about to say he won the 2024 Democratic primary, but then he realized that didn't happen. Yeah, he won the 2020. He won the 2020 primary.
Every single time that people counted him out, and he beat them. It is if it's a Biden mythology, or as we call in the book, that became a theology. The first commandment is Joe Biden always comes back. And the reason why we frame this book as a tragedy is because this. Probably his signature virtue, which is the never giving up, eventually became a tragic flaw. And the way that
never giving up is not a virtue. Do not let stupid people try to convince you that never giving up is a virtue. Knowing your limitations is very important. And anyone who has ever been incredibly successful at something will maybe speak about the virtue of never giving up. But when you actually engage with them in their day-to-day life, they're like, no, you got to know when to shift energy from one thing to another. Like never giving up is just an excuse for why you need to be all in for a loser that the Democratic Party puts in front of you. Plenty of way better virtue to be able to discern when your energy is being wasted than to put all of your energy behind something that will not succeed for one reason or another, especially when it's also not good for other people. Come on. That's so abstract.
The people around Joe Biden describe his decision to run for a second term. What's so striking about it is how little of a process there was, and that it's a given. He deserves it. All presidents get 2 terms. And I think there was, that chip on the shoulder had just consumed him in some ways.
Last question.
Oh, yeah. Another bitter old white man.
As to whether or not as Democrats advance toward 2028, where were you on Joe Biden? What is your example of public cleansing and self-accountability for what you did or didn't do will be akin to the Iraq war vote was in 2008?
No,
it's interesting to ask because several Democrats have used that analogy, right? And they feel that if Hillary Clinton had voted a different way, she probably is president in 2008. And then, but that seminal "where were you at this moment" eventually allowed for a new person to come out of nowhere. In that case, it was Barack Obama. I don't know. I mean, how much does this really affect the politics 3 years from now? You don't know. I think some of it depends on how the Trump presidency goes, because if you're in 2027 and you and the Democratic Party is basically how did we let this happen mode, I think this could be a really key issue.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Like I said before, this book coming out will not help with that particular issue, because this is not a reckoning. This is people trying to avoid a reckoning. This is everyone rushing to be the first person to go like, I secretly knew, I knew this was going on and I wanted to say something, but you don't understand. Like, I've always wanted to work in politics and I have some really big plans about some really big policies that I think would be really great if they got enacted at some point in the next 30 to 40 years. And also my kids go to private school in DC, and how would I be able to afford that private school? Like, you're just going to get a list of reasons that range from like the incredibly personal and financial to like the theoretically, ideologically very, optimistic, right? Like, oh, I want to be in politics so I can affect better change. And so I chose to keep my mouth closed about this thing. But none of those are particularly, I think, very sympathetic when you look at the actions of the Joe Biden administration, and then also like the obviousness of what was going on with his particular like mental fitness. And so like you can't really look, just to sum that part up, you can't really look at people coming out now as any kind of like, positive indication of a different future for the Democratic Party, because they're all doing it for the same reason they did it. Like, they didn't learn anything. They just like the circumstances have just shifted to make this the politically and the most viable thing for your career, because you don't want to be the only person who says like, oh no, I just didn't notice. I was around him all the time and I just didn't notice, because that is, despite the fact that the Democratic Party oftentimes wants people to leverage their legitimacy in ways that make them look stupid, that is just a little bit beyond the pale. And also, Joe Biden can't do anything for you anymore, because like Joe Biden, unless you want to keep working for him, which would probably not be fun or good or interesting if you have an interest in a career in politics, like Joe Biden is going to be persona non grata very soon when it comes to politics. So like there's no reason to continue to show fealty over him versus to try to eke out a little bit of like, positive press for yourself for being the one who came out and threw Joe Biden under the bus the fastest. I plucked this clip out too, because I did want to learn more about this fake town hall, because like, that's so interesting. I didn't deny that they do stuff like this, but I'm curious to see if there's more details about the fake town hall. So you'll have to forgive me if we continue on this topic for a little bit more. But before I do that, let's look at the chat. I want to engage with you all properly. Cop Fiend on Twitch says Biden would be remembered as Obama's pal, but in last hour he wrote himself onto the toilet paper of history. Yeah, and I think that's a indication of the kind of person that Joe Biden is, even if that seems like it runs counter to what I was saying about not being able to hold him like accountable for his actions fully, because he was in fact suffering from some kind of like potentially age or other underlying issue related mental health malady or whatever. Joe Biden is a narcissist. Like, everything throughout his career doesn't make me doubt that like he would have run even if he was going to lose, and even if he was in full control of his faculties, I still think he probably would have chosen to run because he's a narcissist. But that doesn't necessarily change the fact that like the people around him enabled it past the point in which he could have like legitimately done it for himself. Because that's the real thing here. Like, the question is, could Joe Biden have run for re-election had all of his staff decided that nah, they weren't going to help him perpetuate this like falsehood, right? Could he have replaced them all? Seems like not even really. Honestly, like, obviously, if they didn't all leave at once or all rebel at once, the people who stayed could have helped replace the people who left. But in this situation, it is just seemingly true that Joe Biden would not have been able to mount a re-election campaign effort without the people around him doing it for him and using him as like the centerpiece of that election. Like, he would not have been able to replace his staff if they had all left. He wouldn't have been able to organize these things. And you might say that's true of any president, but other presidents might be able to reasonably replace their staff or negotiate that process quickly if they had all rebelled. I don't think he could have. He could have done that at this point. And so they do bear that responsibility because they're the ones who ensure that it continued to happen. Like, one or two people leaving could have been replaced. But if everyone had shown some courage, they could have stopped it, obviously, in a way that like that is just not true for the campaign staffers of even someone like John Fetterman. Like, if they all left, John Fetterman could replace them all. Joe Biden likely could not have. So like they just have to bear like a large portion of that responsibility. Ben McGurthatron 2K on YouTube says they want us to feel bad for a racist war criminal now that he has cancer. Yeah, I mean, they do. I guess we'll have to put a pin on all of those other, the cancer thing until we have more information about that. Tagium on YouTube says nobody did more damage to Joe Biden's legacy than Joe Biden. Like, yeah, I mean, and that kind of also parallels to what he said about if Hillary Clinton had not voted for the war in Iraq in 2001 or 2002 or whatever, like, would she have beat Barack Obama in the primaries in 2007, 2008? And the answer to that question is like, no, but it's also silly to even ask, because like the kind of politician Hillary Clinton would have to be to not have cast that vote is just not the person that Hillary Clinton is. So it's like a useless hypothetical, because for Hillary Clinton to have not cast that vote for the war in Iraq, she would have made a lot of other decisions throughout her career that would have made her a better candidate that she just simply wouldn't have made. It would have been out of character for her to not cast that vote for the war in Iraq. It would have been not what she like wanted. So it's just not like, it's just part of who she is. And so trying to disaggregate those things doesn't really make any sense. It wasn't just one bad decision. It was like indicative of who she was. In fact, we know that when she was the Secretary of State under Barack Obama in his first term as the president, she wanted to go to like outright war with Syria. So like Hillary Clinton is just a war hawk. It doesn't mean Donald Trump is a peace dove, whatever you call it. But Hillary Clinton is a war hawk. So like that's just the nature of the beast there. Like Joe Biden could have redeemed himself by being a one-term president, but then like he wouldn't be Joe Biden. That wouldn't be who Joe Biden is. And that might have been the last vestiges of who Joe Biden was, left unravaged by like the holes in his brain, like just the obstinance. But again, those things could be exacerbated. And I think people have said in the chat, and I believe this, I know in my loose understanding of dementia, like obstinance, narcissism, those things can all be exacerbated or caused by the kind of brain issues that you would expect Joe Biden to have, given what he's exhibited. So like it's in a situation where you can't necessarily disaggregate someone's behavior from the like a mental or psychological issues they're having. That's just a sign of, in this case, general unfitness. We can't be sitting around parsing which decisions Joe Biden made because of his dementia and which decisions he made in full lucidity, because that's like in and of itself a problem. Ben McGurthatron 2K on YouTube says, it just shows the Dems' lack of depth and imagination. They couldn't even think of anyone but Biden for president. No, they couldn't. The lack of bench, definitely. They couldn't get anyone to beat Bernie in 2020. That's just the truth. Joe Biden was unfit in 2020, and none of the other Democrats who they put on stage had any chance of beating Bernie Sanders in a primary election. Kamala Harris wasn't going to do it. Pete Buttigieg wasn't going to do it. Amy Klobuchar wasn't going to do it. None of the like neoliberal rainbow coalition they put together to try to attack Bernie was going to do it. Andrew Yang, Tulsi Gabbard, no one was going to do it. And so they needed Joe Biden to come in still smelling like Obama to like trick people into thinking that they were voting for Obama's third term and to get things back to normal. If there were any other choice besides Joe Biden, I think people would have chosen it, but there just really wasn't, because none of the younger Democrats, even though they had politics very similar to Joe Biden in some cases, none of them had like the name recognition or like the cultural cachet to get them ahead of Bernie Sanders. And even adopting his policies piecemeal, like Medicare for some or Medicare for all who want it, none of that was enough to escape the stink of being a Democrat, unless counterbalanced by the stink of Obama. And so like it really is just that the Democratic Party is not very popular, even amongst Democrats. Okay. So yeah, let's see if they have any information on this, like on this fake town hall.
Damning revelations tonight about the Biden inner circle's efforts to hide his decline, including a scene in which the campaign staged a fake town hall. Why? Well, to quell concerns about his age and ability to interact with people. Joining us in our fifth seat at the table is the co-author of Original Sin, President Biden's Decline, Its Cover-Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again. That is Alex Thompson. He's also a CNN political analyst and an Axios national political correspondent. And Alex, the fact of the fake town hall is not actually the worst part of the story that you report in the book.
Yes, other campaigns have used fake town halls. Now, I would say those town halls usually are in addition to real town halls. Joe Biden was doing neither. This fake town hall was in order to film it so they could make it into campaign commercials. They filmed it in Delaware with supporters. But Joe Biden, at this point, this is the spring of 2024, Joe Biden's town hall, which was closed to press, was so bad that campaign officials determined that it was not usable for a campaign commercial. So they took 90 minutes, 2 hours out of the president's day. They filmed an entire town hall, and they determined that it was not usable. Now, some people say this was because Joe Biden was incoherent. He could not really articulate his thoughts in a pithy or even semi-normal way. Some people just said like the lighting was bad. That was sort of the 2 points of view. But the point is, it shows how like what the campaign status was in the spring of 2024 when they were trying to deal with a candidate that wasn't a decline.
Wait, someone told you the lighting was bad?
That's one of the excuses.
You're saying that they spent millions of dollars to stage a town hall? Well, we didn't get the lighting right.
That was one of the excuses.
I mean, and this comes back to the question.
I know that's not what happened, but I totally get that, because I definitely would scrap a town hall or any appearance I had that was going to be used for promotional purposes if the lighting wasn't good. It just is what it is. Sorry.
How many people were aware of things like that, but
Everyone.
said nothing? And in fact, perhaps publicly said quite the opposite, that Joe Biden was fine, that everything was great. He was perfectly capable of doing this job for another 4 years. So
Absolutely. I was at the Justice Department at the time when we released the Her report, and he was the entire White House infrastructure at the time was calling the report gratuitous and said that Rob Hur should have never called him a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. And every Democratic pundit, I'm not going to buy this book.
Are you serious? I'm not going to buy this book. You know why I would never buy this book? I would never validate a journalist who thinks it's some kind of like gotcha that everyone was lying to me and I didn't figure it out until it was way too late. Because that's the other part of this. And excuse me if I come across as being like all over the place on my criticism here. I expect political insiders to lie about the quality of their candidates. That's their job. The woe is me after you get caught lying, I don't like, obviously, but I expect political staffers, I expect PR people, I expect those people to lie about the politicians that they are supporting. That makes perfect sense, right? What I do also expect and would charge is a core part of the job is that the political media that orbits them, the journalists, are supposed to be in charge of determining fact from fiction, lies from truth. When they try to hide behind everyone in the everyone in the Democratic Party, everyone around Biden, they lied to me and I just couldn't figure it out. So oops, who could, it must be their fault. No, God damn it. Obviously, they shouldn't be lying, but I expect that from them. I also expect you to be able to tell when someone is lying, especially on a lie this big and this obvious. So I would never support a journalist coming out after the revelation that a big obvious lie was obvious that they were caping for 4 years and writing about book how all these political insiders knew and they lied to people. Everyone knew, damn it. Everyone who wasn't paid not to know knew. So it's also the media's fault. Sorry, I don't mean to be it's just, it's obviously there's a lot of fault to go around and everyone is trying to absolve themselves of their personal role. But the media plays there's a big issue with the media here. And it's one that is widespread. And this is just one example of it where it's access journalism. I don't want to lose my seat as an anchor at CNN. I don't want to lose my column space at the New York Times as an editorial writer. And so I'm just going to report on what's being told to me in a way that maybe leaves a little wiggle room to say I don't know if this is true or not, but it's what they said. That's just not what the media, that's not what the journalism is supposed to be. It's not what the, free press is supposed to look like. And a lot of times we accept the argument that they're trying to make about the insiders in Joe Biden staff about them, which is that it's just so much more important to be able to say you're a journalist, to be able to operate in those spaces, to be able to reference that social position and to use that clout for what you want it to, than it is to actually do journalism. They want you to feel bad that had they actually reported the truth, they might have lost their job. But I'm of the opinion that there are certain jobs that by nature of what they are demand you to be be willing to like not either lose that position or even lose your life in the case of like police officers if it means like fulfilling the position, like the details of the position. Members of our media, of our critical media, members of our political establishment want you to believe that it's so much more important that they get to say that they have those jobs, they get to earn the clout, the capital that comes along with those jobs, than it is that they actually fulfill the underlying purpose of them. So like the media trying to absolve themselves of this is not like, you know, escaping me. I'm just interested in the gossip, like I said, but it's a whole rotten system.
It was inappropriate for Rob Hur to say that. And the reality is the whole reason why he put that in is because it was his whole reason not to prosecute. So it's really infuriating to hear this happening in the spring of 2024, around the time that the Hur report was released, and certain aspects in Alex and Jake's reporting really talk about the time frame being fall of 2023, whenever he did his interview with Rob Hur, as well as early 2024 when the release of the report. And so it's really frustrating, I think, as a Democratic Party, hearing now that they were lying to everybody. And not only were they lying to everybody, but they were bashing their own cabinet when it came to the Hur report.
One of the top Biden aides is Tom Donilon, and I'll play a little bit from Tom in a minute. Or I'm sorry, Mike Donilon. I'll play a little bit from Mike in a little bit, what he said after the election. But the nugget that came out about him was that he was paid $4 million to be a part of Biden's campaign from basically February to November. And the Jen O'Malley Dillon was the next highest paid person at $300,000.
Oh yeah, I'd lie too for that much. Smartest man I've ever seen.
Happen? And when you told people that this is what you found out, what was the reaction in the Biden world?
It happened because Biden insisted it was going to happen. When Mike Donilon went to the campaign in early 2024, there were obvious objections among Biden's inner circle and on the campaign of paying Mike Donilon $4 million. But the president was insistent, pay Mike what he wants. You have to remember, Mike Donilon's been with Joe.
Okay. Joe Biden, an old man who was so frail, they almost had to have him in a wheelchair, was so intimidating to people that they couldn't say no to him, right? But not because they are shameless careerists, for some positive reason. It's like I said, be careful about that part too, where people who made money, people who like earned capital, social capital, like professional capital, try to frame all of that as being as unimportant in the face of like, well, I didn't really have a good time in that job. I know I was contributing to like the deterioration of our society, deterioration of like the international liberal order, the deterioration of the Democratic Party. I was making money doing that. I was getting points on my resume doing that, but I didn't have the best time I could have had. It was no summer camp for me. Like, okay, I don't care. I don't care if Joe Biden yelled at you. I don't care if Joe Biden made you feel like if you didn't do what he said, you weren't gonna get another job. Like it really is just a matter of like deciding whether or not you have morals. It just comes across like, yeah, this is Bob Woodward. This is like I have all the heat in the world after like the game is over.